Well, hello there and welcome to another edition of The Big Q. Every year on the 5th of June, Rwanda joins the rest of the world, of course, to celebrate Environment Day. Now, this year, the World Environment Day was celebrated across the planet under the theme on biodiversity, as it was, of course, chosen by the UN Environment. However, the new research from the Intergovernmental Science Policy says 1 million plants and animal species will face extinction over the next 10 years worldwide if nothing is done to reverse the trend of biodiversity loss. And of course, that's why today I am joined by Janet Mugwaneza. Of course, she's the acting SPIU at REMA. Thank you very much for making time to be with us.
Thank you for having me.
We have Madeline Nyiratuza, yes, Head of Sustainable Growth Unit at the UNDP. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And online, of course, I'm joined by Mr. David Smith, who is the PEA Regional Representative. Thank you very much for making time to be with us, David.
It's a pleasure.
So, Janet, I'll start off with you. Of course, Rwanda is celebrating the World Environment Day under the theme biodiversity, but time for nature. You know, it sounds like a call. Are we in danger? Is the nature in danger for us to actually say it's time for nature? It's like a wake-up call, you know?
Yes. Yes and no. In danger on one way or the other. But it's just a wake-up call for all of us because biodiversity or natural environment is the basis of our living as human beings. So we do depend a lot on the natural environment, on the biodiversity. We do get our food from environment, from biodiversity. We do get our water. It's like the nature does offer a lot of services to us to be able to live. So it's a wake-up call that we reflect back just to look at what we depend on as human beings and do better or improve on what we've been doing in terms of biodiversity management and protection.
Maybe you can paint us a picture, you know, in terms of challenges, in terms of the world, what exactly is killing the nature today?
There are several threats or what causes to, you know, issues that are related to biodiversity loss. Of course, but the biggest is the human activities. So we live with nature, but I think human beings been somehow at some point forgetting that it's like you're living in a house and then at some point you kind of destroy part of it, yet you are living under that house. So for biodiversity, of course, we've had, if I go to Rwanda, we've had in the past few years, we had lost most of our natural forests. There's some natural forests that were almost cut off more than a half of the original size they were, such as Gishwati, Mukura Natural Forest, and other small natural forests we have around the country. Of course, we do have some other biodiversity systems that have been degraded due to human activities. Most of our wetlands, especially the one in the city of Kigali, I think you've noticed that the government has now took a bold decision to relocate most of the activities that were being done in the wetlands. It's because those wetlands have been degraded. We do have parts in the country where some of the forests have been degraded, but of course efforts are ongoing for reforestation just to try to bring them back to nature. Even some of our water resources to some extent have been degraded. They no longer have the quality they should or they used to have. A good example, if you travel around and just see the Nyabarongo River, it shouldn't look that way. Having that brown color, it means there's something wrong. Yeah, so I cannot say that there are no challenges. We do have challenges related to biodiversity loss and in Rwanda. Some of the species, we do have some species that are no longer really common in Rwanda. I think if you go to the old people, they will tell you some species that
they
used to know that no longer, available or we no longer see in Rwanda. But as I mentioned, there's a lot of efforts in terms of bringing back or trying to restore what has been lost.
Absolutely. We'll go to the challenges, I'm sure, much more later. But I want to bring on Mr. David Smith. I'm sure you can hear me. If you can hear me.
Yes, very clearly.
Yes, so there's this assumption, that the poor people in particular depend on biodiversity compared to the rich people. Is it a real picture, or in terms, of people becoming poor and others rich, who depend on the biodiversity really?
Yes. Just as an opening, I'd like to thank you on behalf of UNEP for the invitation to this program. And I would like to really congratulate the government for the organisation of the World Environment Day celebrations. They were very impressive, and I had the honour to participate in the webinar yesterday, which had the presence of the Honourable Minister. And the high level of participation, particularly of young people, was very impressive. So congratulations to that. Now, getting back to your question, all people on the planet ultimately depend on biodiversity. However, it's true that poorer people in countries like Rwanda and other African countries depend more directly on biodiversity. For example, on soils, forests and water. This means that when diversity is degraded, then poor people often suffer more and more directly. For example, if soil nutrient levels decline too much because of soil erosion, then agricultural productivity is reduced, which means farmers grow less and earn less. So over time, it is more likely to cause poverty levels to rise if we substantially degrade biodiversity in countries like Rwanda, where the majority of the people depend on natural resources. So in other words, if we don't manage biodiversity sustainably, then food security, water and energy access will suffer. And richer people are less directly affected because they have the money to buy alternatives. So they can substitute, they can import things from other countries. And that is one reason why in richer countries, people are not sufficiently aware of how important biodiversity is, because they're more distant from they're not so directly dependent. And then, of course, we have the issue of climate change, which, through droughts and flooding, is having an increasing impact. And if we enhance biodiversity as a way of increasing resilience to climate change, then we can lower the negative impacts of climate change. For example, if we invest in reforestation or in terracing. And then, of course, in Rwanda, tourism. Biodiversity is a very significant industry around the world because tourists come to see biodiversity. So it's very important that aspect of biodiversity is recognised. And in Rwanda, where local people share from the revenue from tourism, is a very good example of how poverty can be reduced through sustainable management of biodiversity and through benefit sharing. That's very important. And globally, there's increasing recognition of the links between economic benefits and environmental sustainability. And on World Environment Day, my boss, the Executive Director of UNEP, Inga Anderson, and a very famous economist called Professor Surpatha Dasgupta published an article highlighting the importance of biodiversity from an economic perspective. And that is why UNEP, for example, is prioritising nature-based solutions. to try and maintain biodiversity and increase the economic benefits it brings to countries.
Absolutely, but I'm sure someone would wonder, what are these opportunities that even the poor people, or rather the poor nations, can tap into to ensure that this economic gap is actually filled?
Okay, it's important for people to help answer that question. It's important to have a broad understanding of what biodiversity means. It's not just gorillas in the forest or trees or plants. Most economic activities are underpinned by biodiversity. Soil nutrient, that's an aspect of biodiversity. Water quality and quantity, that's an aspect of biodiversity. So if government policy maintains forests and then shares the revenue with local people, if it maintains soil nutrient levels through sustainable agriculture, climate smart agriculture, in a country like Rwanda or Kenya, that will bring a relatively quick benefit to local people because they'll be more productive. Then, of course, in terms of tourism, there's benefit sharing. And on the international arena, there's the somewhat sensitive topic of benefit sharing for biological resources, you know, the medicines, the drugs that can be developed from resources. So it's important that the rich countries don't exploit poorer countries who have such wonderful biological resources, and that's an ongoing discussion in the international community.
Absolutely. Madeline, he talked about us having virtual meetings for the very first time. I'm sure the world celebrated Environment Day virtually. And then we have people actually argue and say COVID, in terms of environment, has actually been a good thing. Because right now we see the rivers are much clearer. In rivers, say like in Paris, where there's a river with lots of boats, but today we have swans that have come back and people are actually surprised. Do you think this is a blessing instead of a curse, as many people would say?
I would say yes, in terms of environmental benefits. Yeah. But in terms also of having a lesson learned from how better world should look like. If we stayed home for months and reduced air pollution, then maybe there is something that we can learn from there on how we can reduce maybe private vehicles sometimes and go for public transport sometimes. There is also another lesson about working from home. If we successfully worked from home for 2 or 3 months, are there ways of continuing this habit for some times? If we had virtual meetings and we achieved some results from them, do we necessarily have to travel from Europe, US to Rwanda and continue pollution for conferences? Maybe there are some conferences that we can keep doing virtually and others that we can really see if it is important to have them maybe in one place. I think there is really a lot that we're learning from there.
Absolutely, and hopefully it will be implemented in the years to come for the benefit of generations ahead. But the 2030 Agenda, of course, for Sustainable Development sets out an ambitious framework, for universal goals and targets to address the various range of global societal challenges, rather. But what exactly is the role of biodiversity in achieving this particular agenda, the Agenda 2030?
Thank you. The role of biodiversity, to me, is, I would say it is huge, because biodiversity is at the center of the achievements of all of other 16 SDGs. And I would say how. I like to say that biodiversity is life, because human beings are part of biodiversity. The air we breathe, the water we drink, and the food we eat are all part of biodiversity. So although the objectives we have under the global agenda around biodiversity are mainly under SDG 14, that talks about life underwater, and SDG 15 that talks about life on land. I think biodiversity loss is going really or continues to affect other SDGs negatively. I can use an example. For instance, feeding the growing world population would require to double food production by 2050. So what we have today should be doubled by 2050 to be able to feed the growing world population. And how do we achieve that? Today, the practices that people have in food production are destroying biodiversity. As you rightly said in the introduction, now we are expecting to lose 1 million species of plant and animals because of human activities. And in agriculture, for instance, if we use pesticides that kill pollinators, we can get good production for 1, 5, 10 years. But in 20 years, there will be no pollinators, there will be no birds, no bees, no insects to allow the production of food. And if also we look at what countries are doing to produce more food. We know about the issue in Indonesia of cutting palm trees for food production. We know some forests in Africa that are being cut down for sugarcane production, or because there is imbalance between population growth and economic growth globally. And what I'm thinking is that for us really to achieve our 2030 agenda, as UN continues to say it, this year 2020 starts the decade of action. We need action. We have been talking about policies, we have been talking about mobilizing people, but now we know that all of the member states of the UN have good policies.
Absolutely.
And the issue remains, what do we do? We know that cutting down forests is not good, but what are we doing to reverse it? Are we conserving natural forest? And another thing is to really understand the integration of all of these 17 SDGs. We should know that to end hunger, we need sustainable actions in production. We need to ensure that air pollution reduces to reduce global warming, because if we continue to have issues of climate change, how can we sustain lives? Now we know recently the issue we had in Rwanda, for instance, if I come to my country, of heavy rains, destroyed crops and some infrastructure. And this is something that reminds us that integrated plans are really important. Yeah, and as you asked me as well about COVID, if I look at the SDG related to health, we sometimes don't think about the linkage between wildlife and people. And when people go to poach or to hunt and eat wild animals, sometimes they feel there is no problem. But we have good examples of HIV. It comes from people who exploited wildlife. We have issue of Ebola, the same. Now COVID-19, we know all the story about it.
Yes.
Now what do we do to ensure that we change our behaviors in a better way after COVID?
Absolutely.
We need a new normal. If we, before COVID, we were at a certain level in integrating our actions for sustainability. Now, as I said, we learned some lessons related to new behaviors. How do we look at good behaviors and maintain and upscale them? For instance, if I keep talking about the relationship between humans and wildlife, I would say we should invest more in research, for instance. How do we ensure that zoonotic diseases are really well researched, and we know what might be the problems in the future and inform the public that, look, if you eat this animal, if you continue wildlife trafficking, this might happen. We don't need, again, to have a lockdown of several months to I would say, we don't need another lockdown for several months in the future.
Absolutely.
This should be a lesson to ensure that we have a way of foreseeing and plan accordingly. For instance, we need maybe to improve how we deal with these pandemics, for instance.
Yeah. But you know, when you talked about it, you brought in a question that I wanted us to follow up on: funding, the issue of funding, you know, in terms of research, in terms of partners like UNDP. Why do we still have, you know, why is still this particular sector is still underfunded, if I'm right, Jenny?
Yes, actually, when you look at the numbers, whether the internal finances and external finances, for the internal finances, at least the national budget, as the government of Rwanda, only 0.9% is allocated to biodiversity-related interventions, while natural resources in general and environment is now around 2.6%. It's still very low compared to actually that as a government of Rwanda, or the Rwanda as a country, we are natural-based economy.
Yes.
So if we are natural-based economy and we are investing less into the sustainability or management of those natural resources, of course, it's still a big issue that the government has to look at and try to work around it. Finances, of course, it's still an issue, not just in Rwanda. But the good thing about it, I think different countries have started to now look at it. So there are different international programs that are there for biodiverse financing, and Rwanda is part of it. We've actually, this is like the fourth year we are implementing one of the program, biodiverse finance, trying to see how, looking at the country, the institutional arrangement, the financial status of the country, the partnership the country has, because finances should not only just, we should not only look at the national, you know, finances, but also external finances. So that's why studies like those were conducted to see how are we as a country in terms of financing biodiversity-related intervention. So we've developed different finance options biodiversity options that as a country can look at in terms of mobilizing more resources, both national and international. And I think now that we even have Rwanda Green Fund for NERA, I think one of its roles is to mobilize finance resources for environment, climate change, but biodiversity as well. But for biodiversity, as we mentioned, this is something that touches to all of us. So even private sector is not out of the context in terms of looking for actions or answers to this issue. So we've been working with private sector because some of their businesses are related to biodiversity. If you just look at how many hospitality industries we have or tourism-related businesses that we have around the country, they are depending on most of their tourism products are related to biodiversity. So meaning they have a role in playing as a private sector. What I can say, there's still need for more efforts from the country, as a country, of course, looking at the institution in charge or the institution that have a responsibility for the national budget, like Minecofin. We do work closely with the Minecofin, trying to see the possibility of tapping into available opportunities to mobilize resources, but they're still very limited compared to. So we've worked with various development partners. Of course, the UNDP is one of them, UN Environment or UNEP, World Bank. So we've been mobilizing through different projects in Rwanda that are being implemented to restore some of ecosystems or biodiversity ecosystems. I mentioned some of the natural forests that were degraded that now have been rehabilitated. That are in future, I think in a few months they will be on the list of the tourism products that we are going to use. Gishwata and Mkura is one of them. So REMA with the Ministry of Environment have mobilized resources through Global Environmental Facility, of course, and the World Bank. So we've rehabilitated the park. We've also increased the size. So it's one of the tourism products that is out, but hoping that as much as we are going to exploit or get or gain from it, we'll also think about the return on those forests that we've restored. So efforts are still ongoing and working with different institutions, but I think we shouldn't take it as something that is going to be achieved in just a few years. If the number or the size of the gap we have is still big, that we cannot say that it will be achieved within 1 or 2 years, but it's continuous. It's going to continue.
Talking of degraded land, but maybe I'll go to David first, because I want you rather to tell us more about the Bond Challenge. You know, that talks about the degraded land by 2030 and where we are right now as a country. But David, I want to bring you in terms of funding, especially as an insider looking in towards, say, the African continent. How do we build in more funds? Because the next question would have been, of course, poverty reduction approaches or efforts lead to the loss, biodiversity loss. Yet here we say if we have the less poverty numbers, we are doing better, So in terms of funding first, let's start with funding. How do we build this up? How do we ensure that we're not just talking, but we are walking the talk?
Okay. There's different sources of funding. There's domestic funding sources. And the way to mobilize domestic sources through the national budget processes and through contributions from development partners like the EU or DFID, the World Bank, is to get good evidence of how investing more in sustainable management of biodiversity will contribute to Rwanda's development priorities and will also reduce the vulnerability to floods and droughts. And Rwanda, which has got a very impressive record in terms of good government and efficient use of funds, it's in a better position in a number of countries to mobilise resources from development partners. Also, domestically, you can apply, carry out what's called environmental fiscal reform, where you design methods of revenue from national parks, from polluter pays principles, from introducing regulations and standards that encourage the private sector and to invest in a more sustainable manner. Then the international arena is also a challenge, particularly now we face the terrible impact of COVID. But in the international arena, there are large funds available, the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility, and there are others. So it's a question of taking best advantage of what's already available, which requires, a cross-government effort by Rwanda that REMA, the Ministry of the Environment, works with Minecofin, key sectors like agriculture to take advantage. And then there is the fact that countries like Rwanda are not causing climate change. So there's an element of a moral obligation on the richer countries to help. But it's important to use funds effectively in a cost-effective manner. And Rwanda is an example to other countries of what can be achieved through the cost-effective management of funds. So that also helps Rwanda to mobilise funds.
So let's look at the point where we say that poverty reduction, or rather the approaches and efforts, can actually lead to biodiversity loss. How does that even work?
Right, that is true, but it doesn't have to be true. Ultimately, there will be cases where there's a trade-off has to be made. But in most cases today, including in Rwanda, poverty reduction doesn't have to be associated with biodiversity loss, particularly in a country like Rwanda where the economy and most people depend on biodiversity. So if you invest in efforts to grow economic growth and reduce poverty that undermine the natural resource base of the country, ultimately you worsen poverty. But practical example, if you have an agricultural intensification strategy, but that's based on the unsustainable use of land, then over time you'll worsen poverty. So another example from Rwanda, a few years ago Rwanda was draining some wetlands, which then reduced the water flowing into the hydroelectric lakes. And soil erosion caused siltation, so less hydroelectricity was generated, so the country had to spend a lot of money on fossil fuel fired generators, and then Rwanda restored wetlands and saved itself a lot of money. So yes, there is a real risk of a trade-off, and there have been many examples of biodiversity loss through attempts to grow economically and reduce poverty, but it doesn't have to be that way in many cases, most cases I'd say. And I'm speaking not as an environmentalist, but actually as an economist, and one of the things that needs to happen is that economic analysis should take into account biodiversity impacts when projects and strategies are being designed, and then there's less chance that there will be a clash between poverty reduction and biodiversity.
Absolutely. Well, with that, we do take a short break, but when we come back, of course, we continue to learn more about biodiversity and how it is actually affecting the different parts of our country. Do keep it the big Q. Welcome back, and thank you very much for keeping it Rwanda Television. Of course, I'm still talking to my guests concerning environment and, of course, more in particular biodiversity. But Madeline, besides biodiversity that also is important, let's talk about the green growth and green cities and why all this is important to us today.
Thank you, Fiona. Achieving green cities is very important because it is useful for human beings to live in safe and clean environment. I would say safe because, for instance, we are in Kigali. If pollution increases, maybe because of old vehicles, we will be breathing polluted air, and our health will be affected. And especially the children. And if children reach a certain age, let us say 20, and they can't continue living because of lung cancer, what do we gain? So element of clean. If we have waste everywhere, like plastic, like garbage, not only it will affect our health, but will also affect water bodies and our soils. And if soils are affected, and remember we need trees in our city for air to breathe, then we wouldn't be able to have good trees. Water bodies will be polluted. Then water we get home for cooking, for cleaning, for drinking, will be polluted again. So all comes around our health. And yeah, and also, as I said, we are happy to have other kind of biodiversity around us, like birds, like animals. Then with issues of empty city without trees, we can't have birds around us.
So green growth is the way out for a better biodiversity?
Yes.
That's what you're saying?
Yes.
Jeanette, the country is looking to reduce emissions by at least 38% over the next decade. And according, of course, to our sources, as RBA, that we covered the story, it has submitted the goal to the AU, along with how it is to be attained. And of course, this will be the first African country to do so.
Yes. Yes, Rwanda is one of the countries that are committed to protect its environment, but with, of course, with the ultimate goal to protect its citizen. So if the country aims to protect its citizen from any threat or any harm, protecting environment is one of the ways that as a country we have to take in terms of achieving that. So the country have submitted its national contributions to UNFCCC as a part of the implementation of Paris agreements. It's one of the first country in Africa, but because I would say this and feel proud of it, as Rwanda, the country is very committed for that. I think you've had David mentioning about different best practices that have been, achieved in Rwanda that other countries can learn to. So being the country that depends mostly on the natural environment or its economy, basically just best. The cornerstone of our economy is the natural resources. It is very important also to have a serious commitment as a country on how to reduce.
But how fast and how easy is this?
Yes, actually, it have started. So these commitments are not something that just came from nowhere. There are already efforts around from different sectors that are being done. Looking at actually starting from the Vision 2050, it talks about quality life. There's no way you would achieve a quality life if you don't have health, citizens. And as Madeleine was mentioning, if we have a polluted environment, if our environment is polluted, we'll have more people who will be sick. What happens to the economy of the country when we have more sick people? It means as the government will need to have a more budget under the Ministry of Health to take care of that. So it's one way of saving. So it's from the vision, the new vision of the country, the new policies, the new strategy also, the National Strategy for Transformation, NST1, also talks about the earning or moving towards a high earning income country, of course, with focus on the sustainable green economy. New policies have been reviewed on how, as a country, we can achieve. There's new environment and climate change policy that have been, published. New policy on the biodiversity and different policies. Even looking at the policies from other sectors. Like agriculture. So we are aiming to move towards sustainable agriculture, promoting sustainable energy or renewable energy, meaning there's already a start. We've already started, but we had to, as a country, we had to submit those commitments and also with specific targets that we'll be achieving on each year. Of course, starting from the implementation of them. So it's something that will be achieved if all sectors and if all people are into it and committed to contribute and work as a team. This is not something that will be achieved if we just look at the Ministry of Environment or REMA. Yeah, so this is a national commitment that as a country, we found as realistic compared to where the country have set its direction in the next years. So cutting the emissions, it's possible. We've now brought in the e-mobility. It's one of programs that will support in terms of transport. If we are encouraging to have more e-mobility, if we're encouraging to have more public transport that is reliable, so that people would actually feel more comfortable to quickly move and take public transport because it's reliable, it's affordable.
Less emissions.
And less emissions. That means we are cutting the emissions. And also, if I look at the industry side, you know, the government have been putting up industrial parks around the country. So one of the reasons to have them at least in one area is to make sure that they are supported in terms of changing or using the advanced technology in terms of emission cutting, be able to manage the waste from, you know, their processes for production, have basic support they can get from the country in terms of supporting. There's a program, the Cleaner Production Program, which actually is there to support industries on how to change their processes in terms of reducing emissions, energy use efficiency, and all that, and waste reduction. So I would say this is not something that, as a country, was submitted as something new. It was based on what we are already doing as a country. Yeah, but just now that we have clear targets, and also to make sure that all partners, they know what Rwanda as a country have committed in terms of achieving. And we know that the country, you know, when Rwanda sets on something, it has to be achieved.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I want to bring in quickly, David, because time is really running out. You know, climate change is often, poorly understood, and this is not just an African issue. I'm sure it's a globally international issue. How do we change this misconception that, or how do you further educate people to understand that it is time for people to look out to, how they eat, the plastic bags, plastic straws, and, et cetera, that we have in the world today?
Okay. I guess the best way to do it is to use examples that people can relate to. Like in Rwanda, because of the terrain, Rwanda is particularly vulnerable to flooding, for example. And so you use examples people can relate to in terms of things like plastic, waste disposal. Sometimes you need to combine making people aware, relating at what they do, with some fairly clear messaging from government as to the costs of this, the impact, how much the city has to spend in cleaning up, how much dirty water makes people sick, that sort of thing. And words will probably not be enough. You will need to have incentives, economic and legal incentives, so that people are encouraged economically, but also, unfortunately, at times there'll have to be legal sanctions. But if also in a country like Rwanda or Kenya, Malawi, the other countries I work in Africa, radio is quite powerful. REMA, other agencies can work together for awareness raising through regular radio programs that people give good advice. And it's also very important to have cost-effective alternatives. If you ban something, if for example, you want to stop people cutting down timber for cooking and heating, they need an alternative. So provide incentives, provide alternatives which are easy accessible and are not too expensive. And as a concrete example, Rwanda, with UNDP, UNEP and donor support, built a green village at a place called Rubaya quite a few years ago now. That's a living example of how people can live more sustainably in a manner that helps reduce poverty, and it generates a positive economic rate of return. So if people have clean energy, ready access to water, then they have an incentive to change behaviour.
Absolutely. Maybe as we sum up, David, what would be your word to everyone that's watching us? What would be your challenge to anyone that's watching us right now when it comes to environment in general?
The main challenge is stop thinking about the environment as a nice to have and understand that the environment is the basis of human well-being, particularly in countries in Rwanda and Africa that are so dependent on biodiversity and other natural resources.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, David.
Okay.
Madeleine, as we sum up probably, but before you give us your challenge, you know, it's one thing to say we can plant trees, but it's another to plant the wrong tree. Because I'm sure many, you know, when you talk to scientists, when you talk to researchers, they say that's the main issue. We say plant trees, but what trees are we planting? You know, that's the question here. Quickly, educate us briefly, tree planting and how it should be done.
Thank you, Fiona. I think for tree planting, it is important to look at which species, to which soil type, and a type of climate conditions. I would say that, for instance, in dry areas, there are some trees that grow faster than others. And if you plant them in, for instance, cold regions, they will not really adapt well in the area. And if I take the case of Rwanda, and I have to commend the government, REMA, the Forestry Department in the Ministry of Environment and others working on environment and natural resources. They have been advocating for mixing native trees with exotics in agroforestry. Because native trees can adapt better in some places than exotics. And also, they might be good at retaining soil or bringing back biodiversity like that. So I think this is the message I should share.
As we sum up, Janet, what would be your challenge to whoever is watching today? Especially, I want us to bring in the youth, you know, to be part and parcel, because they and the future generation relies on what we do today. What would be your challenge to them?
Good that you brought that. The youth are the future of Rwanda. So it's in the benefit of youth to be the change of the situation we are in terms of being the biodiversity and environmental advocates to where they are living, into the communities. And I'm happy to say that we do have some youth groups around the country. Yesterday, some of them were awarded actually the best youth with green innovations in terms of bringing solution to some of the issues we have related to the environment. So I would say that let's plan to leave this planet better than we found it. So if by the time we are born, we are breathing a clean air, let's aim to, by the time we leave this planet, of course we are not going to live here forever, but let's aim to leave it better than we found it. And also take it as something that is the responsibility of each and everyone. So it's also a responsibility of the parents to start teaching your children, the little ones actually, they will listen to you, and what you teach them, it's what they will continue to do growing up. So let's have our efforts put in terms of involving the youth, bringing the solution to the environment, having them be part of the dialogues on looking for solutions on the problems we have in the country.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah.
Madeleine, as we sum up, your challenge to anyone of the youth specifically, you know, who are watching us today.
Yeah, thank you. So for everyone, I would request that we continue partnerships, because it would be through partnerships that we can really achieve SDGs.
Yes.
And also thinking about leaving no one behind. We should not forget vulnerable women, people with disability, because if there is a certain group of people that we don't develop together, then we always have issues. And then for the youth, I like the way youth of Rwanda are committed. You can see that energy is there. And UNDP is working with the Ministry of Youth and Culture and also REMA on Youth Connect program to mobilize young people for entrepreneurship, but also to ensure that their businesses are green. So I would say that they should continue that way, and you are there to be together in that movement.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. David Smith, for making time, of course, and for joining us all the way from, wherever you are. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much, Jeanette, for making time to be with us. Madeleine, thank you very much for being with us. My name is Fiona Mbabas, and of course, if you take good care of Mother Nature will equally take good care of us. My name is Fiona Mbabas. Do keep the big Q.